Hi, everyone. This is part one of a three-part video series with Josh Rossman, the VP of Customer Experience Strategy at Oracle. In this video, we're going to talk about the foundational elements of a CX program. We're going to get into some of the topics that are commonly not covered. And we're going to hear from Josh, based upon his experiences and his own expertise, what are the kind of pieces you should consider before you move on to the actual analysis and execution phases. Josh, let's start off with the biggest pitfalls that companies fall into when they're starting off their programs and looking to, get aligned and get something going.
Could I tell you a little story about a quality experience that I think might resonate, might scare people, but I think it makes the point that you have to pay some attention to this. This is from eBay. And when I was at eBay, we had a fairly well-established touch point set of metrics where we were looking at like the different elements of the experience by the places that customers would touch the platform. In one instance, we came up with this great insight that stockouts during the checkout experience were an issue. So this became an area that the company wanted to invest in and fix. And a couple of months later, and X numbers of dollars into the investment to fix this problem, I got a call from one of the people on my data team, and the person said, "Have to tell you that we uncovered an issue." And the issue was 2 tables in the data warehouse were mislabeled or transposed the wrong way. And when the data came to us, it amplified this issue of stockouts. So when we correct for the tables in the data warehouse, the issue basically goes away. It went like from 5% to 0.005% or something like that. So it went from something that was an issue to something that was a non-issue. And the impact from that was a really big deal. At the time, we had to pivot everything in the team around quality. So I had, I don't know how many, 15 or 20 people working on the team, and all the effort shifted from the day-to-day operating of the function to what do we need to do to bulletproof the quality of our data. And I did tell this story at a function at a loyalty forum sponsored by Bain with a bunch of practitioners in the space. And as soon as I told the story of how the mistake was revealed and who the executive was, and everybody's face turned just kind of ghost white in the audience. They were thinking, this could happen to us because we're not paying attention to quality the way that we should. So, what does pay attention to quality mean? Having a set of checks that you run through each month, checks that just look at basic things like, what are your scores trending month over month? Is there a drop or an increase in the score that's not really possible if you were sampling properly, like sort of outside of the bounds of what you would think would be normal? What about the response rate? There are all kinds of things that can happen with the transmission of data and surveys and emails going out and making it all work properly. So pulling together a basic set of metrics to look at on a monthly basis that would maybe be indicators that something's off that you should explore. It's a really good policy. So those are some of the basics of things that are pitfalls in the early stages of getting something ramped up.
Now, all that requires a lot of different skills. How do you think about team? Do companies need a centralized CX function in order to pull all this off?
I think it's extremely useful to have a central function. You almost have to have a central function that's looked at as an impartial source of feedback and analysis and insights to the company. That impartiality is valuable, but it's also a skill set. I mean, the idea that there are some very specific activities that a CX team needs to perform. And they revolve around sort of this data analytics culture model, but like sending surveys, constructing surveys, receiving them, managing all that. it's a skill that it's more efficient if you put it in a central place. Same is true with analytics. And you know, when you have a group that is able to look beyond what would be the responsibility of one stakeholder, they kind of see it end to end. That group can be very strategic with their insights and their reach across an organization.
And if you're going to assemble your dream team for CX, who do you usually hire? What are the kind of roles and responsibilities are you assembling to be able to execute on the CX program that you're building?
So it's kind of there's a nice combination of skill sets that can operate really well together. If you go back to kind of the operating model of data, analytics, and culture, the data team, these are analysts that really need to understand how to work with data and spreadsheets and tools and technologies and SQL and like all of the whole world of gathering and manipulating and storing and building dashboards and managing tools. I mean, you need people that have that skill set to focus in that area. They may not be the ones that are going out and doing a readout to a CEO or a leadership team, and that's just fine. But they have to, you know, there's a person on my team that likes to call this like turn in the wrench turners. And it's funny that like every role is so important that you could have one CEO facing person that if they mess up, the impact is less significant than if the wrench turning goes wrong. So everybody actually plays. There is really we try to have a flat team and make sure everybody knows that what they do is really, really important, because you can't mess up the data element. You can't mess up the analysis and the strategic part of it. And then you can't mess up the stakeholder engagement. So all three of those are critical, and they're different skill sets. I mean, you think about like, what would you need to be able to interpret feedback and crank out insights? Part of it depends on what you're trying to do with the program and the culture of the company. If you're on the one end of the spectrum, really like a hyper data-driven, analytics-oriented company, then that needs to be reflected in the types of analysis that you do, and you probably need a little bit more, higher order statistics and data science people and skill set in that function. If you're on the other end of the spectrum and you're keeping an eyeball on the customer experience for learning purposes, and you want to just understand what customers are thinking, well, then the skill set for that kind of analysis may be more market research and marketing oriented. And then the culture piece, if you are taking this central team and using it as a way of driving change into the company, then this is a strategic role. These are more senior people that can engage cross-functionally, can have an executive presence, and that they're very important to do the kind of work that they do, but those are not the ones that are going to be kind of working like with you guys day in and day out on at least on the management of surveys, right? So it's a mixed skill set.
And once somebody has this team assembled and they're looking to kick off their program, let's talk a bit about goals. Why is it so important to define goals up front, and also at the same time align on realistic expectations for the program?
This also has a kind of a sequence to it. And when you start off a CX program, how are you supposed to know how much the metric will move? You don't. So you could either wait and you could explore for a year, 2, 3 years and try to figure it out before you goal, or you could just goal and see what happens. And I've lived through this many times, and I've seen it to the point where I kind of created a model for like the evolution of setting goals. And it usually begins with an aggressive goal that's aspirational in nature. Maybe it's the CEO saying, kind of go get them. We're going to set this target, and the target's +10. Well, who knows if +10 is something that's achievable? It may be, and it may not be, but I think when you're at that early stage and it's coming from the CEO, might not be designed to actually, and this is not the way you really want to look at it on the front end, but it's designed more for driving action and getting people to pay attention than it is setting an achievable goal that you can hit. So given that, you probably don't want to compensate people on the goal before you understand, how you can achieve it. That's, sort of the aspirational early stages. And, hopefully that does drive action when, maybe there wasn't as much of a focus before. And if you get to that point and you kind of start operating with it, and you listen to customers, you hear what they're saying, you understand like the top 3 things that need to change, you go out, you change those things, you see that it moves the score by 4 points in a year. That's an indicator of what you think you might be able to do going forward. So then the kind of the goaling becomes a little bit more realistic, a little bit less aspirational, and then you really dive into the tactics of breaking it all apart and looking at the sub metrics and figuring out like whose work influences which metric and who should be gold on which metric. But the general evolution starts off a little bit scattered and a little bit messy. But I think that I would agree with the thinking that that's better than waiting, because the longer you wait, the more this kind of work I think becomes marginalized. Like, you don't want a CEO to make an investment in a group and then have that group say, well, we're gonna pay dividends back to the company in 2 years. That just doesn't work. You have to have something that's coming now or soon to be able to work. And then goaling, once that becomes like enabled, then you're talking about sort of bottoms up in the company, changing the culture and changing the behavior and making it more customer centric.
And that's where when you have those goals defined and you're trying to iterate on it, and you're measuring it, it all comes back to the customer experience and breaking it down into those different layers. You've brought up this concept of a CX pyramid, where you've talked about it in a few minutes ago, of how you have brand and you have different layers of that experience. How do you define the different aspects? Like, if an organization is looking to start executing on the CX program, what do the layers of that pyramid look like? And then we'll talk about how you break it down and measure it.
I like to think of just sort of start with the top. Like, what if you could only have one metric? That can't be satisfaction with a product. That can't be the satisfaction with or the net promoter score of a sub-segment of customers. That's got to be like an Uber North Star top level goal, and something in the order of net likelihood to recommend a brand, likelihood to recommend SurveyMonkey, likelihood to recommend Oracle, likelihood to recommend whatever company. But that metric alone is not enough to give you all the details of what you need to do across the business. So then I start thinking about, well, what comes next? And I can use technology as an example, since that's where I've worked mostly. You want to know about the products. I mean, you absolutely. I mean, most companies sell products or services of some sort. You want feedback about what customers are buying from you, not just the brand. And you want to know how it's going along their experience of buying the product, using the product, getting supported for the product, and all through that cycle. So having some way of measuring the product itself, having another way of measuring the supportability across the experience, and then looking at, sometimes this is referred to as journey stages or episodes or milestones, but looking at the different places where customers are likely to engage and being able to measure those and identify where things could go wrong, like where you might need to intervene. Super important. At eBay, we looked at the customer base like in 2 dimensions, like there's sellers and there's buyers on the platform. And there was a third that emerged through Net Promoter that was kind of interesting. It was buyers who sell. So it's kind of a hybrid. It's both. There are sellers, there are buyers, and then there's this group of customers. Turns out that they're really valuable, and they do both on the platform. But it also turns out that when you look at behavior, that first experience from somebody, let's say Philippe's bought 100 items over the last 10 years on eBay, and then last week you listed your iPhone and it was the first time you've ever tried to sell something on the platform. If that experience goes well, you're going to be likely to list more items. If that experience goes badly, then you're probably not going to list more items. So that was an area where the company identified this segment. They figured out that this is a group where, like, across the journey, we need to measure, like they back then, need to measure what happens in the experience when a former buyer only lists an item to sell. And that became like a use case for why, what are the journey steps, and like what are these areas where you might want to go in and intervene and treat either a customer type or an experience that they go through differently.
And in your opinion, you don't necessarily have to measure every aspect of the customer journey. There are places where it does matter more than others.
I think that you'd go crazy if you tried to do that. Like, and I've seen walls around conference rooms with journey maps in small font that like walk through every possible step of a journey. And that's kind of, sometimes that's the beginning of an effort to go out and measure everything. And if you're really operationally excellence minded, you go look across all of these and identify the areas where it's the most likely area where there's going to be a problem, or I think they use the word defect, and then you go in and you try to measure the ones where where there's a risk or there's a benefit for getting it right. But even that, I mean, we're talking about, if the scope of a pyramid like this would be a net promoter high level or some satisfaction high level metric, a layer that includes like a product view, but we're not talking 100 products. We're talking boil it up to categories or something, where even for a company as complex as Oracle, you could boil it down to 5 or 10 families that are sort of big and that we want to measure. Support, the support experience kind of fits possibly like underneath those products, but then the journey, I mean, 5 stages, 3, 10, it's not 50. It's not the whiteboards of like the journey maps around the conference room, because some do matter much more than others. And part of the again, kind of going back to the very beginning, the intro of like the data, measuring what matters on a survey is really important. And if you get that crisp and concise, and what parts of the business you need to understand, and which customers you need to understand it from, then you can build it around those requirements.
Let's talk a little bit about attributes. So for each of those areas, let's say product or brand, what are the kind of attributes people should think about, and why is it important to have additional attributes that you're trying to measure about that experience?
The type of question that you're asking to kind of open up a survey, like Net Promoter, you're asking, how likely are you to recommend SurveyMonkey to a friend or colleague? If that question is a brand level question, then the attributes that you want to understand are the brand level attributes of SurveyMonkey. And I don't know what those are, but there's some that sort of carry over company to company. What's the satisfaction with the value for the price? What's the satisfaction? We talked about the sales experience. What's the satisfaction with the utility of the product itself? Like how is the support gone? I mean, sort of these brand level, big sweeping ideas that support likelihood to recommend. I mean, a good place to start would be go to marketing and ask them, what are the brand attributes of the company? That's kind of a good initial wish list. Most marketing groups have done some kind of brand work, and they should know. Like at Oracle, I mean, we have a big marketing organization, and I'm a part of that. And you better believe we know the brand attributes of the company. So I suspect, like, if you're looking at something like a Net Promoter brand level metric, measure the brand attributes. If you're looking at a product experience, go to the product teams, talk to them about what are the elements of the product that are important to them to hear about. Start there, and you can kind of round that out if they're not thinking about some things that you think would be important. Maybe an engineer is not thinking about pricing, but pricing could be really important. Maybe they are, but like, you want to aim it at the elements of the product that relate back to the kind of overall metric that you're asking at the beginning of the survey. Same thing would be true for a journey experience. I mean, if you pick something like in enterprise sales, you have to go through like the agreement to terms of a contract. Like maybe that's something that a company wants to measure. So what's that first question? Satisfaction with the blank experience, with the contracting experience, if that's the example. And then what you would want to measure as an attribute would be, what are the elements of the contracting experience? And I don't know what they are, but there's probably 5 things or 5 or 6 or 8 things that you could understand by just, going and go through the experience yourself and figure out what customers go through, what you want to measure, what do they tell you about that's important to them. That's another good source. But the general rule is you want those attributes to be something that when you're getting a scorecard, you can look at that scorecard and understand how it relates back to your top level metric.
And once teams sit down, they're talking to their marketing department or the product team, and they're trying to define those attributes. Just like the really long customer journeys that are not useful for anybody, do you have like a rule of thumb on when it comes to the maximum or minimum number of attributes that should be defined for product, for support, for brand?
Well, it's hard to put a rule against that, and there's always exceptions, but I think you should be aiming for kind of the 5 to 10 neighborhood. If you have only 1 or 2, it's probably not enough, and maybe you have to rethink the questions that you're asking. And if you end up with 20, that's too many. Some of them probably aggregate into like broader categories. So, I mean, you wanted to think of it this way. You want a customer to be able to get through a survey of a top level, like anchor question number 1, qualitative open-ended feedback, and then a set of attributes, and do all that in about a minute.
And that's a great segue into survey design, because once a team understands what their CX pyramid looks like, they define the different attributes for every layer of that pyramid, then it's time to design the survey. And do you mind talking about of your approach to survey design, and why is it really important to ask those kinds of basic questions, but tweak it a little bit with wording?
So here's my general guideline on anything, actually broadly across the development of a CX program, and it applies to surveys too. Test your way through it. People will have different, by people, I mean executives in the company, stakeholders in the company, they will have different perspectives on what should be on a survey. As an example, there was a group at eBay that wanted a longer survey. Because they wanted more information. There was another group at eBay that wanted 1 question and an open end, net promoter and an open end, because they wanted to solve for response rates. And practitioners get put in a situation where they have to pick A or B. And I think the right approach there is take half your sample, run A. Take the other half of your sample and run B, and compare the results. Because what if the response rate is not, it is not materially different? Then you may, in this example, you're better off with the longer survey because you're getting higher quality, more data to work with. So the answer to a lot of like, should we do this or should we do that? Go do both, figure out what works, and then there's your answer. So testing and learning is kind of an important way to approach this. But specifically with surveys, like the way that I've come, I don't know if it's contrarian or if it just is something that makes sense if you think about it, but I've come to a model after just testing and learning through 15 years of getting a lot of things wrong along the way. And we've talked about a lot of this already, that like designing a survey where you have, I look at it like 3 questions: an anchor question in the net promoter example, net promoter, the open end, and I like with the open end to ask a different question of the promoters than the rest of the customers, than the rest of the respondents. So You can, and I see this a lot on surveys that I take and then screenshot. You can ask, what's the likelihood to recommend? How satisfied are you? Whatever that first question is. And then the open-end question, you can say, I see this all the time, why? Sometimes it's just one word, why? Or sometimes it's, tell us why you gave us that rating, or please explain, or do you have anything to add about like why did you rate that way? And I've read, it might even be in the millions at this point, but I've definitely read hundreds of thousands of customer comments over all these years. When you ask why, you're kind of inviting a short answer, a very broad, very generic answer. And to the extent that you can action off of the feedback that comes from these qualitative responses, you want it to be more specific than that. You don't want somebody to say, love SurveyMonkey, if that's the reason they gave you a 10, or somebody gives you a 2 and then they just write support stinks. Like, that's not enough. Or if it's maybe a more specific part of the journey, like we talked about contracting was confusing. You get these one-word answers. So the way I've changed that open-end question over time is to ask the 9s and 10s to give you what they love or what they like best. If it's Net Promoter, what is it about SurveyMonkey that makes you likely to recommend us? If it's a product question, you're talking about like Oracle ERP solution, what is it about that product that makes you so satisfied? You want to know what's going well. And when you ask somebody, why did you rate a 9 versus what is it that you really love about our product, you get a different answer across large numbers of responses. And then all of the rest get a wish list, like an ask for what we need to do differently. And I've seen this worded different ways, but the gist of it is, what could we do different? What could we do differently to make it more likely that you'd recommend us in the future? Or if it's a satisfaction question, what could we do differently to make you more satisfied with this product or this experience in the future? That invites a wish list and sort of an opening up of what customers want to see. And if somebody, I used to use the example of licensing, where it actually, so the word was confusing. Like customers would respond, why did you rate that way? Well, I was confused. Or, this was that word, like if you did a word cloud, the word confusing would pop up as the biggest word. And it's pretty hard to interpret that. You can go back to the manager of that part of the business, like somebody runs licensing. You can go back to them and say, hey, look, our customers are confused. We need to simplify this. But what does that mean? So, telling a business stakeholder to unconfuse something is less good than if you ask a customer, if you ask the customer to respond with what could we do differently to improve your experience in the future, and they say, look, I don't know what end is up and these things pass without my knowledge. Please send me an email 3 weeks before X date so that I understand what to do at what point in time. Well, that's like gold for the business stakeholder because it's specific, it's actionable, and they can take that into their business plan. Maybe they do, maybe they don't, but like at least the customer gets a voice at the table, and that voice is explained in a way that the company can do something about it. So that second question, being very specific about like, asking something different of the promoters and all the rest has definitely generated a lot of value over time. And then the third section, it's just these attributes, and they're very important to answer the question. Like you're going to get, let's say that the initial ask was go run Net Promoter and figure out what the company's Net Promoter score is and get the qualitative responses to understand what customers are talking about. That's great. So eventually, maybe it's 3 months, maybe it's 6 months, maybe it's a year later, you get a baseline and you understand, well, what's your Net Promoter score? And maybe you get that baseline relative to what the competitors' Net Promoter scores are. And you start to look at the topics that are coming back. And yeah, these customers are talking a lot about, they have a pain point with the sales experience, or for these customers over here, they're not using the product the way that we want them to, so they're complaining about the price. Like you find out all these insights. And then somebody's going to say like, well, what do we need to do? What do we do differently? And if the only thing you have to work off of is the qualitative feedback, sometimes that's enough to figure out like the categories of things to work on. But what happens after you've done that is someone's going to say, what's it going to take to move the score? Like, what's it going to take to move net promoter? And the worst case would be you told the company that these were the top 3 things that are coming out of the qualitative feedback. And your baseline score was positive 50. You wanted to get to positive 60. So the company invests millions of dollars trying to fix the things that you told them needed fixing. And a year later, the score is 50. So explain that. Why did this score not move? Like, why are we not making progress on net promoter when we just spent a year and a lot of money fixing the things that you said customers told us about through the net promoter surveys? That's a problem. And that's a problem for the practitioner in the room who's on the other end of that ask. You could say, well, you know, net promoter is a slow moving metric and it takes a long time to move it. But then what happens a year later if the score is still 50 and there were more millions of dollars spent? You have to have a way of explaining the impact of your actions on the score, and that comes from these sub attributes. Because we talked about this before too, that there's this more direct connection between action and results of the metric, and that way it's a lot easier to celebrate the success if you invested in initiatives that drove 10-point improvement in 3 attributes. And you know, maybe the competitive environment changed, maybe there were other forces putting downward pressure on net promoter, but that doesn't mean that the teams that worked on these initiatives didn't have tremendous success doing what they needed to do for their part of the experience. So constructing the pyramid of what you measure, the survey hierarchy, in a way that factors all this into account it's really important. The way to approach other sources of feedback is and not or. Do you want to use surveys, or do you want in-product feedback? You want both. Do you want surveys and in-product feedback and focus groups and other maybe live interactions? Yeah, you want all of those. So if you're not getting what you want from one mechanism, then look at other options elsewhere. If you can't, if you're sending product surveys out to customers who haven't used the product in the last year, then those aren't the people that you want to hear from. You have to have a way of removing the friction, getting the feedback asked to the customer at a point in time that's meaningful for them, and giving them the mechanism to give you feedback when they want to do it, not just when you want to pull them with a survey link. So, you know, at the end of the day here, where's this going? If I were to say right now, hey, GOOGLE, 20 devices would all light up in my house asking like, what do I want to know from the the assistant. It seems like in-product feedback is really high quality. It's a good experience for customers if it's not intrusive within the product, but if it's done properly, it's a good experience because it lets them give you feedback when it's on their mind. And doing it in a way where there's no friction, where they can just say, like through some sort of a voice assistant, I really want to give feedback now. So, hey, this is what I want to tell SurveyMonkey, go deliver it. Maybe there's the place for a digital assistant in the future of feedback collection. But right now, like multiple places, surveys that are mindful of who's done what, if you can get to that level of information, user groups, social media, outside sources, all of these are ways that you can get insights into how customers are feeling about your product.
Yeah, I agree with that. And ideally, whatever solution you're using, you're trying to integrate everything together as much as possible so that the data is flowing and you're able to embed your surveys in email. For example, somebody's using Eloqua, they're able to drop it into their nurture sequences. How should companies think about oversampling and the risks of that? where does the CX team try to sit down and draw the lines for who gets a survey, how often, and when shouldn't they?
Part of what can drive that is the number of customers that you have. So clearly, you don't want to be generating survey fatigue on the part of your customers. It depends on what you want to know and what level of granularity you want your analytics to reveal. So if you want a pulse check on Net Promoter, it's different than if you want to segment the detractors that talk about that talk about the sales experience that are in Germany, that are large enterprises that, like, once you, and then you want a meaningful sample at that level of granularity, you sort of need to start with what's the most granular place you want to end up, and then reverse engineer the sample that you need, and then reverse engineer from there the number of surveys to go out based on your response rate. There's no specific answer that would apply to all companies on that question, but a good way of thinking about it is how granular do you want to get, and do you have enough customers to take you there? A good rule of thumb that many companies use is once a customer's taken a survey, they're out of the mix for at least 90 days. Sometimes it's 180 days. Sometimes it's different than that. But you don't want somebody getting a Net Promoter survey every 4 weeks. Clearly, they're not going to take it. And you want the survey to be as light, and by light I mean sort of easy to take and short, to the point, measuring what matters, so that executives will take it. So that decision makers will take it, so that whoever you want feedback from won't be put off by the fact that you've created a lousy survey.
And there's also a bit about not just the right messaging design of the survey, but also the communication that you're sending out to these people. Do you have a preferred way of messaging it to get people to take the survey?
The way I think about a survey invitation, because often respondents will go into a survey and they'll start it and figure out that they don't want to take it, and they'll kind of abandon. So there's an abandon rate that you probably track with your customers, the abandon rate of surveys. I like the first question to be embedded within the email invitation. So put the wording of how you ask for feedback, what goes in the title, put that aside for just a second. The response rates for the number of people that are willing to just click a button in the middle of an email, it's quite different than the number of people willing to, like, click a link, go into a survey, and then answer the first question. So if you're looking for a way of capturing at least the most number of responses on your top level metric, I've seen some success with having just a question built into the email itself. And then framing the language in the way that the customer speaks is better than framing the language in the way that the company speaks. So we want to hear from you. We value your feedback. SurveyMonkey wants to put your feedback to good use, and things like that are useful. But it's also, if you're a company where, let's say you've got a product that customers, they try the product before they buy. A lot of companies do that, where you're offered a period of time you can use the product and see how it goes. And then maybe inside of the company, the language referred to is, you look at a conversion rate, or a lot of companies have a funnel. They're looking at the funnel, and then they want customers to go through the funnel. Don't use words like conversion and funnel in your email to ask customers to take a survey. And it sounds almost funny, but you'd be surprised that companies actually do this. You just get the language that you use day to day is so entrenched that it finds its way into marketing collateral. It finds its way into survey emails. So, asking a customer about what they, what it is they love about the product since they've tried it is better than saying like, what's it going to get to convert you or move you through the funnel? So being mindful about the way you present the language that would resonate with the customer is a good guideline. And setting it up to also, just like the survey, short, sweet, put the link in there so that they know how to click into it easily. And if you can embed that first question in, then all the better.
Are you also a big fan of personalizing the email or the notification to that individual, or keeping it generic?
I've always personalized them so that it would say, Philippe, we value your experience as a customer and want to hear from you. So I mean, so if by personalize you mean add the person's name, absolutely. In some cases, you even want to reference what they've done, what you want to know about, or like what they've recently done. If you can do it in a way that's not creepy, that doesn't look like you're following them around or too much. But for the user of a product, referencing them by name and that you want to hear about the product that they use is nice. It's I think another one of these cases where what's the benefit from that? Will you get more responses if you personalize versus not personalize? Test it. Test A and B and see what you get. I mean, why would you not personalize if you could? You probably would. You probably wouldn't choose dear customer over dear Philippe, unless there was some kind of technology limitation where you didn't know that information. And in some cases, if you're embedding feedback within a product and it's a digital product where the customer has not logged in, then you're not going to personalize it because you can't. But so subject to some just inherent limitations. But if you're talking about a standard email where you know who the customer is, then a personal note is better than not.
And in wrapping up this section, what do you think is the biggest takeaway you want to leave with the audience about this first part and aligning on a CX strategy?
Well, I think, step back a little bit and appreciate that there are a lot of pieces to a CX program. It's really not easy to build and operate one. To build and operate one, there's a lot of places where things can go wrong. We've talked about some of those. Don't try to do everything alone. There's a lot of companies that have gone through experiences that, there's a lot of literature online. There's things like what we're trying to do right here, sharing practices and talking about how companies can do better. So be mindful of those risk factors, those areas that we've talked about where you can have trouble. Be mindful of the sequence and don't try to do too much too quickly out of order. If you're going for the big rollout, the big bang of, we're gonna implement a platform and we're gonna start setting goals and get everybody in the company involved, but you haven't even done the basics of who do you want to ask what question to, and how do you sort of structure your data world? How do you anticipate being able to run analytics off of that? What are some of the hypotheses that you want to test in your analysis before you kind of get to that phase of actions? Be mindful of that. And don't be afraid to ask for help.
And I think that's a great place to stop. Stay tuned for part 2 and part 3, where we're going to go into the analysis phase and then the action phase.